I'm not the kind of person who usually shares my life story online, and I'm definitely not the type to air out family business for strangers to comment on. But if you're reading this, chances are you've been betrayed by your own family, too. And you know exactly how much that hurts. Stop. My name is Ryan. I was born and raised in a small town in northern Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the worst thing you can do is let your neighbors see your family fall apart. And yet, that's exactly what happened to me. I lived in a house that was rotten from the inside. I just didn't see it. Not until my father died. I have an older brother named Kyle. He's 6 years older than me, the firstborn, the golden child. He went to a proper college, started his own company, bought a house in the city. My mom always spoke about him with sparkly eyes. And me, I was the youngest, the freelance guy who worked from a laptop in the basement and didn't talk much. I don't blame my mom. Honestly, I got used to being compared. Kyle always shined. Me, I just existed in his shadow. There was only one person in the family who never looked down on me. That was my dad. His name was Michael. He was a plumber, a hands-on, blue-collar worker, but he was the kindest man I've ever known. Every time my mom scolded me for not having a real future like Kyle, he would quietly leave a cold can of soda on my desk, sit with me for a few minutes, and then walk away without saying a word. Some nights, I'd hear him mumbling in the garage, "That kid might be quiet, but she's got more morals than that loudmouth ever will." The house we lived in, he built it with his own hands. I'm not exaggerating. He wired the electricity himself, built the wooden fence around the yard, laid every brick after long shifts at work. One time, while we were painting the kitchen together, he told me, "This house belongs to you, Ryan. You're the one who truly belongs here." I remember that day so clearly. The smell of fresh paint, classical music coming from his old radio, golden afternoon light catching on his silver hair. I laughed and asked, "What about Kyle?" He shook his head. "Kyle never saw this as home. He just passes through." And then, he died. Suddenly, one cold winter morning, he had a heart attack while shoveling snow in the yard. No one had time to react. I was the one who called 911. I was the one who rode with him to the hospital. I watched them rush him into the emergency room, and I was the first to hear the doctor say he didn't make it. Kyle was in Florida at some business conference. He flew back 2 days later. The funeral felt colder than I expected. I stood silently beside the oak casket, while my mom cried without much feeling. Kyle wore an expensive suit, shaking hands like he was the only son. And in my head, one thing was clear. I had to hold on to that house, no matter what. Not because I wanted to own it, but because I knew it was the only thing my father left for me. The only thing that still made me feel like I belonged somewhere. But I was wrong. It all started when I discovered my dad never left a will. I didn't find out about the will from my mom, not even from a lawyer. I found out from a bank clerk. I went to submit some real estate tax paperwork, fully thinking I just needed to follow what my dad had told me. But when they looked it up, the woman at the counter frowned. "The house is still under Michael Evans. There's no will, no transfer of ownership." I stood there frozen. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad, the man who always told me to be careful, to plan ahead, had never written an official will. That night, I went home and asked my mom directly. She looked at me like I was being difficult. "Your dad didn't have time to do any of that. You think he knew he was going to die? Don't make a big deal. The house belongs to the family. There's nothing to fight about." I stared at her for a long time. There was something in her eyes, something I'd never noticed before. A kind of coldness. Closed off. It felt like talking to a stranger. Then Kyle spoke up at a tense dinner shortly after the funeral. He set down his wine glass, straightened up, and said, like it had already been decided, "I think it'll be easier if Mom puts the house under her name. Then later, I can use it as collateral for an investment loan." I froze. I looked at my mom. She nodded, barely, but I saw it. I asked, "What about me? What about what Dad said?" Kyle shrugged. "You can still stay for a while if you need to, but it's time to figure things out. We're all adults here." I wanted to slam the table. I wanted to scream that Dad never wanted Kyle to have that house, that he looked me in the eye and said, "This is yours, Ryan." But I didn't say a word. I stood up, left my plate untouched, and went out to the backyard, the same backyard where Dad and I rebuilt the fence, where we planted wildflowers around the bird bath. I looked at the dry, dying flower pots and realized something. In this house, I had no power, not on paper, not in my mother's heart, and not in my brother's eyes. A week later, Kyle brought in a locksmith and changed every single lock. He sent me a short, cold text. I've finalized things with Mom. If you need to, get your stuff, call ahead. I didn't call, I didn't go back right away. Instead, I rented a tiny room near my studio job. I started piecing myself back together. And sitting in that cramped room, I thought about every little part of that house. The nails I hammered, the door I painted, the sprinkler system I designed for Dad. And I knew I wasn't going to let this end like that. I'm not the kind of person who seeks revenge. But some things, if you don't fight for them, you'll be stepped on forever. And I wasn't born to be stepped on. I left that house in silence. No shouting, no tears, not even a goodbye. All I took were 3 cardboard boxes, clothes, my laptop, some personal stuff, and my father's old watch. My mom stood on the porch, arms crossed. She didn't walk me out. She didn't ask me to stay. She just said one thing: "You sure you're not blowing this out of proportion?" I didn't answer. I just looked at her one last time and walked away. I moved into a tiny rental room near where I worked, just big enough for a single bed, a desk, and a small shelf. Every night, I'd lie there staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to footsteps from the tenant upstairs, and wonder, what did I do wrong to become a stranger in my own family? I never found an answer, but I knew one thing: I couldn't keep living as the one who got left behind. I kept working. I kept submitting design drafts to clients. I still joined Zoom meetings, still smiled at the right times, and still ended emails with, "Have a great day." But I was a ghost. I stopped posting on social media. I declined dinner invites. I went to work quietly, came home quietly, existed quietly. Even the people who once said, "I'll always be there for you," disappeared, because no one wants to get involved in family drama. In the 3rd week, I went back to the old house at night, not to demand anything, just to look from across the street, over the fence. Kyle was watering the plants in the yard. The flower pots I once cared for were gone, replaced by some modern landscaping. He turned on the porch lights, the same ones I'd wired and installed myself, and for a moment, I felt like a stranger. I used to belong there. Now I was just some guy on the outside, looking in, like a thief mourning what he once had. I turned away, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. A few steps later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mom. "Stop standing out there. People will think you can't let go. Kyle says you came by again. I hope you'll be reasonable." I sat on a park bench nearby, rereading that message over and over, as if I couldn't believe it was real, but it was. That was my mother. No blame, no concern, just cold indifference, like I was disrupting the peace they'd rebuilt. After pushing me out of the picture, I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I dug through old emails, photos, notes, anything I still had connected to that house. I found photos of me fixing the roof for Dad, receipts from Home Depot for building materials, utility bills with my name, for 3 straight years. I used to think keeping that stuff was just an old habit. Turns out, it was the only proof I had that I ever belonged there. Not as a guest, but as someone who lived and breathed in that house. The next morning, I walked through the park, leisurely, got an older man sitting on a bench smiled at me. "You're Michael's boy, right?" I was surprised. It had been a long time since anyone spoke about my dad with warmth. "Your dad and I used to play ball at the community center," he said. "He always bragged about the fence you two built together. Said you were way better with tools than he ever was." I chuckled. Something cracked open in my chest. "He always said, that house belongs to Ryan. He treats it like family." I turned away, hoping he wouldn't see the tears welling in my eyes. That night, I called Mr. Carl, a lawyer I'd briefly spoken with after the funeral. I asked to meet the next day, in his small, paper-stuffed office. I told him everything. This time, I didn't sugarcoat it. I laid it all out. That I was pushed out by my mom and brother, that the house was taken, that I was labeled a burden, cut off from the only place I called home. Carl sat in silence for a moment. Then he said, "They think you'll stay quiet, but if you've got the paperwork, and if you're ready to fight, I'll help." I walked out of Carl's office with a folder full of documents. No guarantees, no promises of victory. But for the first time in months, I didn't feel powerless. Carl explained it clearly. Without a will, my dad's estate would be subject to state inheritance laws, meaning my mother, Kyla, and I would each get an equal share. If my mom had transferred the house into Kyla's name without a proper inheritance process, without written consent from all beneficiaries, that could be considered an unlawful asset transfer. The real question was, did I want to go that far? I wasn't sure. I didn't want to drag my mom into court. I didn't want our family's name splashed across the local paper with headlines like, "Son sues mother over dead father's house." I didn't want to become the guy everyone whispered about at church on Sundays. But I also couldn't live the rest of my life feeling like I'd been thrown out, like I was just a squatter in my own past. So, I began rebuilding step by step, the same way my father rebuilt that house after the storm in single quotes 98. I moved out of that tiny rental into a small studio apartment with its own kitchenette. I replaced old, broken furniture with things I bought myself, with my own money. In my spare time, I started studying property rights, civil law, and how people win when they're cut out of inheritance, not with tears, but with logic and paperwork. Gathered every receipt I had from repairing the house. I found old emails with Dad, planning the kitchen remodel. I printed out photos, labeled them with dates, and made notes on the improvements I'd made over the 3 years I lived there. I wrote down memories, not to wallow in them, but to remind myself that I didn't imagine it all. I had truly lived there. I had belonged there, and slowly, I began to realize, I wasn't just fighting for a house. I was fighting for my place in my own family's story. One afternoon, I was sitting at a coffee shop near my job when I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated, then picked up that it was Aunt Laura, my mom's younger sister. "Ryan, I don't want to meddle in family stuff," she said, "but I heard about the house, and I just want to say, you're not crazy, and you're not wrong." I froze. Aunt Laura had lived in another state for years. We barely kept in touch. "I remember your dad saying, plain as day, that house belongs to Ryan. He's the only one who stayed. The one who took care of us. Took care of the house. Your mom knows that. She just chose to forget." I clenched the phone, my whole body tense. "You have a right, and if you stay silent, Kyle will think you're weak forever." That was the final push. That night, I reopened the half-drafted email to Carl. Subject, ready to proceed with legal action. I hit send. No more turning back. The next morning, as I was making coffee, my phone rang again. This time, it was Kyle. I didn't pick up. He texted me instead. "So you're dragging mom to court now? Cool, just remember, who can afford the better lawyer?" I stared at the screen. Like I was reading the weather. I didn't respond. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to clap back. I had started playing by the rules. And this time, I was playing to win. I wasn't born to be fighter. I was the good son, the one my mom used to call the quiet one, the one who avoided conflict, the one who kept his head down even when he was being pushed aside. But that day, when I signed my name on the first legal document challenging the transfer of my father's house to Kyle without consent, I knew I had entered a war, and there was no going back. Carl, my lawyer, was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and sharp, hawk-like eyes. He didn't promise me a win, but he was direct. "If you want what's rightfully yours, you'd better be ready to be the bad guy in their version of the story. But the truth doesn't need to be liked. It only needs to be proven." That sentence played on repeat in my head that entire evening, as I sat alone in my cramped studio apartment, staring at an old photo of Dad and me, and I asked myself, if he were still alive, would he be on my side? In the weeks that followed, I started collecting every shred of evidence I could find. I dug through old emails with my dad about the kitchen remodel. I printed receipts for paint, tools, and materials. I found hand-drawn sketches I'd made when we planned the living room makeover together. I even asked neighbors to write signed statements confirming they'd seen me repairing the porch roof, mowing the lawn, repainting the fence all those years I'd lived there. When I handed Carl the thick binder I'd put together, he smiled. "Well done. You weren't invisible, not like they thought." Kyle, meanwhile, was still Kyle. When he found out I'd hired a lawyer, he texted, "Ryan, stop making a fool of yourself. You're not on any legal papers. This is a waste of time." I didn't reply. Instead, I sent the full complaint to Carl, and he issued an official notice to both my mom and Kyle, requesting a dialogue before the matter went to court. Their reaction? Predictable. First, panic, then, anger, then, silence. One morning, I got a voicemail from my mom. She didn't call directly, just left a short message. Ryan, are you really dragging the whole family into this mess? Your father hasn't even been gone a year, and you're already fighting over the house. I'm so disappointed. I sat there, speechless. I used to believe that if anyone in the family would understand me, it would be my mom. The same woman who sat by my bedside when I had a fever, the one who slipped a note of encouragement into my backpack in ninth grade when I was being bullied. But it seemed she had chosen Kyle's side. Or maybe more accurately, she'd chosen the illusion of a peaceful family over the messy truth of a child she pushed away. Carl told me calmly, "You don't need to prove your mother is wrong. You only need to prove that your rights were violated." He helped me file a petition with the county court to nullify the transfer of the property due to lack of consent from all heirs, and to request a legal redistribution of the estate based on state inheritance laws. That petition would take up to 60 days to process, and during that time, my mother and Kyle started changing their tone. Kyle was the first to reach out, not to apologize, just to feel things out. "Ryan, I know you're pissed about the house," he said, "but you're taking this way too far. Can't we sit down and talk this through?" I answered plainly. "I tried talking at the beginning. You were the one who locked the door, changed the locks, and texted me to get out." He was silent for a few seconds, then softened his tone. "Mom doesn't want this to escalate. Neither do I. If there's a way to settle this without going to court," I cut him off. "I don't want money. I want the truth recognized. I don't want to be the guy who survived my dad's funeral just to get thrown out like trash." He sighed, then hung up. The next week, I got an invite to a friendly meeting, a sit-down between both sides: Kyle, my mom, her attorney, Carl, and me. We met in a small conference room, dim yellow lights above, air thick with tension, like someone might break down in tears at any moment. My mother spoke first. She wore a beige cardigan. Her hands were slightly trembling at the cuffs. "Ryan," she began softly, "I don't want this to become a battle. It's just, after your father passed, everything happened so fast." Kyle was the only one around. I leaned on him. I looked directly at her. Not angry, just steady. "Mom, I lived in that house for 3 years. I took care of Dad when he was in the hospital. I repaired the place, kept it from falling apart. I didn't walk away." She turned her face, didn't respond. Her attorney stepped in next, trying to steer the conversation. "If Ryan agrees to drop the complaint, we're open to offering financial support to help him get back on his feet." I let out a quiet laugh. "I don't need charity. I need justice." Carl leaned forward, calm but firm. "My client isn't asking for the house. He's asking for recognition, and if that can't happen outside the courtroom, the court will make it happen." The meeting ended with no agreement, but I knew, this time, I was the one in control. Kyle wasn't smirking anymore. My mother no longer used that guilt-laced tone to shame me into silence. They were scared of the truth finally coming out. That night, I stood across the street from the old house. I didn't go in, just stood there, staring at the fence I once painted, at the rose bush I planted when I was 24, still standing there, lonely in the middle of the yard. I didn't want to take the house by force. I wanted to take myself back, my voice, my dignity, my self-worth, all of which had been stripped from me. I didn't expect anyone to take my side. I was fully prepared to fight alone, from beginning to end. Then, something unexpected happened. The first person to reach out was Julia. Julia was my ex-girlfriend. We'd broken up more than 3 years ago, peacefully. No betrayal, no drama, just two people who'd grown apart. She still kept in touch with some mutual friends, and somehow, my story had reached her ears. Her message popped up on my phone. "I heard about your dad's house. Just wanted to ask, are you okay?" That message made me freeze in the middle of the coffee shop. It had been so long since someone had asked me how I was. Sincerely, no opinions, no judgments, just concern. I replied, "I'm trying to be. It's all more complicated than I expected." For some reason, we kept talking. Little by little, Julia became someone I could confide in, not to seek advice, but just to be heard. One night, she said something I'll never forget. "Ryan, maybe you won't get the house back, but I don't think they're scared of losing property. I think they're scared that you're no longer easy to control. I had never thought of it that way. I'd been thinking this whole time that I was fighting for material justice, but maybe, deep down, I was reclaiming something bigger. Control over my own life, the very thing they'd gotten used to deciding for me all these years. After weeks of confronting my mother and Kyle with quiet strength, that was the first time I felt lighter. I started rebuilding my life, for real this time. I rented a small office space to take my freelance work more seriously. I joined a legal support group for people who had been cut out of family inheritances, not because I wanted to gang up on my family, but because I wanted to help others who'd been treated like I was. Carl looked at me differently than he did on day one. "I like this version of you better," he said with a knowing smile. I didn't say anything, but I knew he could see it. I was rebuilding from the rubble, and this time the foundation was mine. I didn't know if I really wanted to go back to the old house. After all the months of drifting, I had finally found a new place. Nothing fancy, nothing special, but it was mine. Paid for with my unfit, a place no one could take away. The apartment was only 500 square feet, but every morning, it was filled with sunlight. I bought a few small plants, hung a picture of my dad above my desk, and kept a small shelf with the books he used to love. Kyle had the big house, the fancy car, the praise from friends. I had peace. And sometimes peace is the one thing guys like Kyle will never have. As time passed, the case moved closer to its final stage. One day before the court date, Carl called me into his office. He placed a fresh folder on the table. Inside was a formal settlement offer from Kyle and my mother's attorney. There, offering to redistribute the value of the house, Carl explained, part cash, part symbolic assets, to avoid making the case public. And you'll be allowed to keep certain personal belongings that belonged to your father. I sat in silence for a long moment, reading the document. Then I asked, "If I agree to this, will they think I lost?" Carl shook his head. "If your goal is to drag them into the light, you still can. But if your goal is to force them to acknowledge that you're not disposable, to make them sit at the table and compromise with you, then you've already won." I nodded and signed. 1 week later, Kyle sent me a text. "I didn't think you'd actually go this far, but you were serious. You win, Ryan." I read it, didn't reply. I just opened my phone, snapped a photo of my new workspace, morning light pouring through the window, landing gently on the photo of Dad, and saved it in a folder I named New Life. That fall, I received a formal invitation from my mom. It was for the 60th wedding anniversary celebration of my grandparents, a big family gathering, aunts, uncles, cousins, all the people who used to call me Sharon's sweet little boy. At first, I considered tossing it in the trash, but then I paused, not because I wanted to make peace, but because I realized I didn't have to hide from anyone anymore. I wasn't the boy who avoided conflict, wasn't the son who backed down when his mom gave him that look, wasn't the shadow who fixed up a house he didn't legally own. I was Ryan, and I would show up, not to reclaim a place in the family, but to put an end to how they saw me. I arrived at the event in a simple white dress shirt, gray blazer, and a pair of leather shoes I bought with the paycheck from my first big freelance contract. The party was held at a classy Italian restaurant downtown. The moment I stepped in, all eyes turned up. My mom stood beside Kyle, laughing with relatives. When she saw me, she froze. Just for a split second, but enough for me to notice the discomfort. Kyle couldn't hide the surprise on his face. I smiled, walked in, shook a few hands, accepted some polite hugs from people who used to believe I was the ungrateful brother suing for inheritance. One of my aunts leaned in and whispered, "Your mom said you wouldn't come. Everyone thought you were done with the family." I replied quietly, "I'm not mad, just busy rebuilding my life." The party went on, at least on the surface. I kept my distance from my mom and Kyle, chatted with younger cousins, then politely excused myself early. But just as I was heading for the door, my mom stepped forward. "Ryan, wait a second." I stopped, turned to face her. She spoke slowly. "I didn't think you'd come, but I'm glad you did. Everyone says you look different." I gave her a faint smile. "I'm still me, Mom, just not someone you can dismiss anymore." She was quiet for a moment, then blurted out, "Kyle may have gone a little too far. I won't deny that. But things were messy back then. I wanted to keep the family stable." I looked at her, for the first time, not with anger but with clarity. "You wanted peace, so you let me carry the damage, but it's okay now. I don't need anyone's approval anymore. I turned to leave. As I stepped toward the parking lot, I heard someone call out, "Hey, Ryan." I looked back. It was Kyle. He stood there, hands in his pockets, face softer than I'd ever seen it. "I'm not going to apologize," he said, "but I'll admit you're not who I thought you were. You did something I never expected." I simply replied, "That's the thing, Kyle. You misjudged me from the beginning." Then I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment, feet propped up on the desk, a cold beer in hand. On the table sat a business card from a real estate startup company. They wanted me to redesign their entire website and manage their digital branding, a full-time gig with a salary I never thought I'd reach. I thought about Dad. If he were still here, he probably wouldn't say much, just a gentle pat on the shoulder, a quiet nod, and I'd know he was proud. It was never about the house, never about the money, never about Kyle or Mom finally saying sorry. The real win was this life, a life they couldn't control, couldn't rewrite, couldn't guilt me out of. I had lost everything, then found myself again. And that, it was the sweetest revenge of all. One late afternoon near the end of the year, I got a phone call from Reverend James, the elderly pastor from the church near my old neighborhood. "Ryan, would you be able to stop by the church this Saturday afternoon? There's something about your father and the old house." I didn't understand, but I agreed. When I arrived, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The slanted handwriting was unmistakable. "If you're reading this, it means you're strong enough now, strong enough not to return out of anger, but because you've chosen forgiveness." "Dad," I sat silently in the small back room of the church. Reverend James explained. My father had left that letter just for me, asking the church to hold on to it until they felt I was ready. The letter wasn't long, just a few lines, but enough to remind me that Dad always believed I'd stand back up, even after being thrown out of the very home I once called mine. A few days later, I drove past the old house. A for sale sign hung from the gate. The house stood quiet, yard overgrown with weeds, dust is clinging to the windows. Kyle and my mother had moved out long ago. New homes, new lives, but perhaps not as peaceful as they'd once imagined. I stepped out of the car, stood in front of the gate, not to reclaim anything, just to say goodbye. I used to think that the house was everything, a container of memories, the last piece of my father, the only refuge I had, but I finally understood. Home isn't made of bricks and wood. Home is where you can be your full self without being pushed aside. And I had found that place, not in a building, but in the life I built with my own two hands. On the day I moved into a newer apartment, a bigger one, with a bright little workspace, I hung Dad's photo right beside the front door. A friend came over and asked, "Why don't you have a photo of your mom?" I smiled, because the person who taught me that love is a gift, not a tool for manipulation, was my dad. Now, I don't carry resentment. I go to work with people who respect me. I write books about toxic families, not to expose, but to help others avoid spending 30 years learning how to love themselves. I have a cat named Pepper. She doesn't care what my past was, as long as I open the tuna can on time, and I have freedom. One time, a student in the life skills workshop I volunteered for asked me, "Mr. Ryan, if you could go back in time, would you choose a different path?" I paused, then said, "No, because if I had taken the easier road, I would have never known how strong I really am." The best revenge isn't making them say sorry. It's making sure they never have the power to hurt you again, to drag you down, to define you, or make you feel small. I'm no longer the shadow in my father's house. I'm the man who walked out of that shadow and built a life no one can tear down. And I know, somewhere my dad is looking down and smiling.